Celeste Mercer had spent 35 years building a life that looked flawless from every angle: a name on the school, a seat at the foundation's table, a son dressed in pressed collars and soft shoes who sat in the front row and never caused a scene. She thought she knew every person inside those walls, every face, every function, every risk. But there was one man she had never really looked at, a quiet figure in a gray maintenance uniform who moved through the corridors without a sound, and she had never once considered that he might be the only person listening to what her son was desperately trying to say. The morning she fired him in the hallway, she was certain she was protecting Weston. By midnight, she would understand she had just taken away the one thing keeping him tethered to the world. If you love stories about compassion, family secrets, and the kind of emotional reversal that changes everything, stay with this one until the very end. Mercer Academy stood on a full city block in a part of town where the hedges were always trimmed and the parking lot filled with vehicles that cost more than most people's annual salary. The school bore the family name not because the Mercers had donated a wing or endowed a scholarship fund decades ago, but because Celeste Mercer herself had restructured the entire institution from a failing preparatory school into one of the most sought-after private academies in the state. She had done it in 4 years, the same 4 years she spent raising Weston largely alone after her husband's death, and she had done it without anyone ever seeing her waver. People who worked with Celeste described her in the same cluster of words: precise, controlled, efficient, formidable. People who worked for her added a quieter word that no one said aloud: distant. Celeste accepted all of it as the cost of being taken seriously, and she had long since stopped questioning the price. Weston was 7 years old and had her cheekbones and his father's way of tilting his head when something caught his attention, and until 8 months ago he had been talkative in the particular way of curious children who treat every adult as a potential source of information. He had asked why clouds moved in one direction while the wind blew from another, asked why certain words sounded the same but meant different things, asked why some buildings had gargoyles and others had none. Then something happened in the Mercer family home on a Thursday evening in October, and Weston stopped asking questions. He stopped talking almost entirely. He began repeating a gesture with his right hand, a slow, deliberate movement that Celeste initially dismissed as nervous habit, then watched with growing dread as every specialist she hired studied it and returned the same uncertain verdict. Possibly a self-soothing behavior, possibly an attempt at communication, possibly a response to unprocessed trauma. No one could tell her what the gesture meant, and no one could tell her what had frightened her son into silence. Dr. Meredith Langston, the child psychologist Celeste had brought in from a practice 2 cities away, was the most honest of the professionals Celeste paid. She told Celeste that Weston was trying to say something, that the repetitive hand movement had the intentional rhythm of language rather than the automatic rhythm of anxiety, and that the obstacle was not Weston's willingness to communicate, but everyone else's ability to understand what he was saying. Celeste drove Weston to school each morning herself, which was the one act of her day that had nothing to do with strategy or control. It was simply the 8 minutes of the morning when she felt like a mother rather than a CEO. She watched him in the rearview mirror sometimes, small, in his car seat, repeating the gesture against his knee as the city scrolled past the window. She always told him Sheila loved him when she dropped him off. He always looked at her with eyes that held something just beyond language, something patient and heavy, and she always felt the gap between them like a physical pressure against her ribs. She paid for the best professionals, the best therapists, the best teachers, the best everything, and none of it had given her back the sound of her son's voice. Archer Hayes had been at Mercer Academy for 2.5 years, and in that time he had replaced 712 ceiling tiles, repaired 23 pipe fittings, repainted the gymnasium baseboards twice, and been invisible to approximately 90% of the parents who moved through the building. He was 38 years old and had been deaf since a construction accident at 31 that had taken his hearing in one sudden and permanent afternoon, and he had spent the years since building a life that worked around that loss, rather than despite it. He communicated by reading lips when the light was good and the speaker faced him, by writing brief notes on the small pad he kept in his breast pocket, and by the American Sign Language he had spent 2 years learning after the accident with the same focused patience he applied to everything. He was not angry about his deafness the way people sometimes expected him to be. He was not inspiring about it, either the way other people seemed to want. He had simply reorganized his understanding of the world around a different sensory vocabulary and gotten on with the work of raising his daughter alone. Piper Hayes was 9 years old and had learned to sign before she learned to write in cursive, and she moved between spoken English and sign language the way other children moved between playing and eating, without transition, without effort, as though both were simply natural states of the same continuous life. She attended a different school across the district, and in the evenings she and Archer ate dinner at the small table in their apartment and had conversations that ranged from the migration patterns of birds to the specific injustices of her third-grade classroom, all of it in the fluid, expressive grammar of sign language punctuated by Piper's habit of humming when she thought. Archer had never told Piper she was remarkable. He simply let her be what she was, a girl who had grown up understanding that communication was larger than sound, and who treated that understanding as the most ordinary thing in the world. At Mercer Academy, a handful of the wealthier parents had developed the habit of speaking about Archer as though he were a piece of infrastructure rather than a person, mentioning the leaking faucet in the third-floor restroom in the same tone they would use to report a malfunction in the building's heating system, gesturing vaguely in his direction when he was in earshot, as though his presence were no different from a cart of cleaning supplies. Archer noticed all of it. He had become, since the accident, an extraordinary observer of behavior in the way that people often become when one major channel of information closes and everything flowing through the remaining channels sharpens. He read posture, eye movement, the small choreography of hands and mouths, with the attentiveness of someone who understood that the actual meaning of a moment was often the last thing being said aloud. He was not bitter about how people treated him at Mercer Academy, but he was paying attention. It was a Wednesday in late February when he first noticed the boy. Archer had been replacing a section of hallway baseboard near the east wing classrooms, the methodical work of measuring and cutting and fitting that he found genuinely satisfying in its incremental precision when he looked up and saw the child sitting alone on the bench outside the resource room door. The boy was small, well-dressed, with the particular stillness of a child who had learned that stillness was a form of safety. He was moving his right hand in a slow, deliberate pattern against his knee, a movement that most people would have read as fidgeting, a restless habit, the kind of self-soothing motion that anxious children and anxious adults both fall into without awareness. Archer did not read it that way. He went still himself, set down his tools quietly, and watched. The movement had an intentionality to it, a shape that repeated with too much structural consistency to be random. The child was not fidgeting. He was signing, or trying to sign. The form was rough, the way a word is rough in the mouth of someone who has never spoken the language but has heard it used and is attempting to reproduce the sound from memory alone. but the underlying intention was unmistakable to someone who had spent years living inside that language. Archer approached slowly, placing himself in the boy's peripheral vision rather than directly in front of him, giving the child the option to look away without making it a confrontation. The boy looked up. His eyes were careful and tired in the way that only happens to children who have been studied by too many adults for too long. Archer crouched to the boy's eye level and signed slowly, the sign for safe, open hands pressing gently downward. Then the sign for friend, index fingers linking briefly. Then a sign he improvised, a gesture he hoped communicated slow down, breathe, take your time. The boy went completely still. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, not quite recognition, but something between the two, a quality of attention that Archer recognized immediately because he had worn it himself, the expression of someone who has been trying to be understood for a very long time and has just encountered the possibility that understanding is actually available. Delaney Brooks, the school's learning support specialist, came out of the resource room and found Archer crouched by the bench signing to the Mercer boy, and her first response was the instinctive alarm of an educator who has been trained to be protective of vulnerable children in unstructured situations. Then she watched for another 30 seconds and felt the alarm recede. The child who had spent the last 3 months refusing to engage with any adult, the child who had exhausted 2 certified therapists, a behavioral consultant, and a specialist brought in specifically to address selective mutism, was looking at the maintenance worker with his full attention, tracking the man's hands with an expression of concentrated effort rather than withdrawal. Delaney stood in the doorway and did not interrupt. She watched Weston lift his right hand and sign the word he had been trying to communicate for 8 months. The form was imprecise, borrowed from imitation rather than instruction, but the intention was clear. Archer read it and his expression changed, not alarm, not confusion, but a slow, deliberate focus, the way a person looks when they have understood something that does not yet make complete sense. The word Weston was signing was attic. Celeste was walking through the East Wing corridor on her way to a meeting with the head of school. When she turned a corner and saw Archer Hayes crouched in front of her son, moving his hands, her first response was cognitive rather than emotional, a rapid assessment of the scene as a potential liability, a maintenance worker engaging unsupervised with a vulnerable child, the kind of interaction that in any institutional setting represented a category of risk that needed to be managed immediately. Her second response, arriving half a second after the first and with considerably more force, was purely emotional. Someone was touching her son's world without her knowledge or permission, and she was afraid of what that might mean. She crossed the hallway with the specific velocity of someone who has made a decision before fully registering all the available information. Archer saw her coming and rose to his feet, reaching for the notepad in his breast pocket with a movement that was clearly habitual and clearly meant to initiate a reasonable conversation. Celeste did not wait for the notepad. She asked him, and her voice was the precise, controlled voice she used in boardrooms, which was a voice designed to leave no room for misunderstanding about who held authority, what he thought he was doing interacting with her son, without authorization, without credentials, without any qualified basis for this kind of engagement. Archer wrote quickly, 2 lines. Weston is signing. He is trying to communicate something. He needs someone who understands ASL. Celeste read the note and felt under the fear a flicker of something she would later identify as shame, the brief recognition that she was looking at information that mattered and choosing not to receive it. She pushed the flicker down. She told Archer Hayes that she was not asking for his interpretation of her son's behavior, that engaging with Weston in this way, without her consent, or the consent of his medical team was entirely inappropriate, and that if he was found near her son again, she would contact the head of school immediately. Vaughn Mercer appeared at the end of the corridor at precisely the wrong moment, or, as Archer would later understand, at precisely the right moment for Vaughn. He was Celeste's cousin by her father's side, a man in his early 50s with the particular confidence of someone who had been adjacent to money for so long that he had come to regard it as a personality trait, and he served on the board of the Mercer Foundation in a capacity that Celeste had always described as advisory, but that Vaughn had spent the last 2 years quietly working to expand. He looked at the scene, Celeste facing the maintenance worker, Weston on the bench watching, and he said, smoothly and immediately, that surely the last thing Weston needed was to have a complete stranger, however well-meaning, conducting what amounted to unsupervised therapy in a school hallway. He said it with the tone of someone raising a sensible concern, but his eyes moved to Weston for just a moment, a quick and involuntary assessment, before returning to Celeste. Archer noticed it, Celeste did not. Celeste fired Archer Hayes that afternoon in the main office with Delaney Brooks present and 2 other staff members who happened to be there. She told him that his position was being terminated effective immediately, that the termination was related to his having engaged with a student in a manner inconsistent with his job description, and that he would be paid through the end of the month. Archer listened without changing his expression, collected his tools from the East Wing corridor, and paused once at the end of the hall. Weston was still on the bench. The boy watched Archer walk away and began to sign, faster now with something close to urgency. Attic, attic, attic. No one in the hallway understood what he was saying. The week after Archer's termination was the worst since Weston had first gone silent. He refused food at dinner 3 nights in a row, not dramatically, not with protest, but with the blank, removed quality of a child who had retreated so far inside himself that the external world had become irrelevant. He woke at 2 in the morning on 2 separate nights and did not cry. Weston rarely cried anymore, but sat upright in his bed in the dark and signed the same word over and over until Celeste came and held him, unable to tell him she understood, unable to do anything except be present in her own helplessness. Dr. Meredith Langston came to the house on the 4th day and spent 2 hours with Weston and emerged from the session with a careful expression that Celeste had learned to read as the professional version of "I don't know." The doctor said again that Weston's gesture was clearly an attempt at specific communication, that the repetition suggested urgency rather than anxiety, and that what the family needed was someone trained in American Sign Language who could make a real attempt to decode what the child was trying to convey. She said this carefully, because she was a perceptive person and she had noticed the shift in Celeste's expression. Delaney had been composing and deleting the same text message to Celeste for 3 days when she finally drove to Celeste's house on a Saturday morning and rang the doorbell. She had worked at Mercer Academy for 6 years, and in that time had navigated Celeste, Mercer's authority with the combination of genuine respect and careful pragmatism that the situation required, and she had never once arrived at her employer's home uninvited. She stood on the step and told Celeste, as directly and as gently as she knew how, that she had watched Archer Hayes sign to Weston for less than 4 minutes and accomplish more than 3 months of professional intervention, and that whatever had happened in that hallway, the child's welfare had to be the deciding factor, and the child's welfare required that someone call Archer back. Celeste stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. Then she asked Delaney to come in. It was the decision that cost Celeste the most effort she had spent on anything in years, not because she lacked the intelligence to recognize that she had made a mistake, but because recognizing it and acting on it required her to dissolve the fiction she had been maintaining about having every situation under control. She called Archer Hayes that evening. He picked up on the third ring. She had not considered until that moment that he would not be able to hear her voice, and she sat for a moment in silence before understanding that he was waiting, and she hung up and texted instead. She typed, "I need your help with Weston. I understand if you say no." He texted back in less than a minute, "I'll come." Archer arrived at Mercer Academy the following Monday morning, not as an employee but as a consultant, a distinction that Celeste had arranged at Delaney's suggestion in order to manage the institutional awkwardness of the situation. He came to the resource room where Weston was sitting with Dr. Meredith and Delaney and took a seat across from the boy at the low table, and he signed, "Hello, I'm back. Take your time." Weston looked at him for a long moment with the careful, measuring expression that had become his default engagement with the adult world. Then he began to sign. The words came in fragments, imprecise and out of sequence in the way of someone working from incomplete vocabulary, but the fragments were consistent, and Archer assembled them with the patience of someone who understood that meaning emerges from accumulation rather than completeness. Attic, box, green, Uncle Vaughn. Mother crying, attic, green box. Archer wrote each translated fragment on a notepad, passing it to Dr. Meredith after each exchange so she could follow the progression. Delaney sat very still beside Celeste and watched Celeste's face change, not dramatically, not with visible collapse, but with the slow shift of someone recognizing a landscape they have been looking at without properly seeing. Celeste had been searching for 8 months for the source of what had broken something in her son, had paid professionals, and reorganized her schedule and held him through night terrors, and sat across from him at the dinner table while he signed a word into the air that no one could translate, and now a man she had fired was sitting in a small room writing down the pieces of her child's silence, and the pieces were forming a picture that she was beginning to understand. The evening of the previous October when Weston had gone quiet was the same evening Vaughn had come to the Mercer family home to discuss the foundation's investment restructuring, a meeting Celeste had arranged and then been pulled from by an emergency call that had lasted 2 hours. She remembered Vaughn and Weston had been alone in the house together for part of that time. She had thought nothing of it. She thought of it now. The attic of the Mercer family home was not a space anyone used regularly. A peaked, dry room above the 3rd floor, accessible through a narrow door at the end of the upper hallway, used for the storage of the particular miscellany that accumulates in large old houses over decades. Celeste had not been up there in over a year. She went that evening, with Delaney beside her, and Archer waiting at the foot of the attic stairs, because it was not his house, and he had not been asked, and he understood the appropriate boundary. She went through the attic with a flashlight, moving past stacked boxes and covered furniture with the specific focus of someone who knows what they are looking for but does not yet know precisely where it is, until she found the back corner where the original wainscoting had been patched with a newer section of pine board that did not quite match the age of the surrounding wood. The board was not nailed. It was set in place. Behind it was a metal cash box painted green, and inside the cash box were 47 pages of financial documents, 2 pages of what appeared to be forged authorization letters bearing Celeste's signature, and a legal memorandum dated 11 months ago, outlining a restructuring plan for the Mercer Foundation that would have transferred operational control from Celeste's direct authority to a newly formed advisory committee, a committee whose proposed membership consisted entirely of Vaughn Mercer's professional associates. Celeste sat down on the attic floor with the cash box open in front of her and the 47 pages fanned across her knees, and she read slowly, the way you read something when you are trying to find the error that will let you disbelieve it and cannot find the error. The financial documents detailed a series of advisory fees that had been authorized under her name and directed into an account she had never opened, a pattern so methodical that it had clearly taken months to construct, each transaction small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic review, each one bearing the forged initials that the forensic specialist would later describe as a competent but not expert reproduction of her signature style. The memorandum about the advisory committee restructuring was written in the careful, bloodless language of corporate governance, the language of people who understand that the most significant acts of betrayal are most effective when conducted in the vocabulary of procedure. She read it twice, and then set it down, and looked at the slant of the attic ceiling above her, and thought about October, about the phone call that had pulled her from the meeting, about Weston sitting somewhere in the house while Vaughn moved through its rooms. She thought about the particular cruelty of telling a child that no one would listen to them, the surgical precision of it, the way it had worked exactly as intended for 8 months. Celeste sat on the attic floor for a long time with the documents in her lap. Delaney sat beside her. From below, neither of them could hear anything. But the house felt different now, the way a space feels different when the thing that was hidden in it has been removed. Weston had been 7 years old in October, a child who asked why gargoyles decorated some buildings and not others, and he had seen his uncle hide a box in the attic and had heard Vaughn say, because Vaughn had not known the boy was there, had not seen him in the shadows of the upper hallway, that no one would ever listen to a child who couldn't even talk properly, and Weston had gone quiet, not because he was broken but because he had believed, in the way that children sometimes absorb adult pronouncements as absolute fact, that his silence had been prescribed for him. He had spent 8 months trying to unsay that silence with the only language available to him, and he had been right all along. Vaughn Mercer moved quickly when he understood that the box had been found. He had spent 11 months operating on the assumption that control of the situation meant control of information, and the loss of the physical evidence accelerated the timeline he had been managing with careful patience, pushing him toward the emergency board meeting he had been positioning for as a contingency, a procedure under the Foundation's bylaws that allowed any board member with standing concerns about executive conduct to request an extraordinary convening on 48 hours' notice. He filed the request the morning after Celeste found the box, citing concerns about the CEO's judgment and decision-making capacity in light of her son's ongoing medical situation, framing the entire construction with the practiced language of someone who had rehearsed it many times. The meeting was set for Thursday. Celeste spent 48 hours that she would later describe as the most clarifying of her professional life. She retained an attorney, arranged for the original documents to be examined by a forensic specialist, who confirmed the signature forgeries within 24 hours, compiled a financial analysis of the Foundation's accounts over the preceding 3 years that revealed a pattern of misappropriated advisory fees and redirected investment returns totaling an amount that made her attorney's expression shift considerably, and arranged for Dr. Meredith Langston to provide a formal clinical statement confirming that Weston's account of events, as translated through his sign language, and Archer Hayes's interpretation, was internally consistent and bore the structural characteristics of authentic memory rather than confabulation. She also called Archer and asked if he would come to the board meeting. She told him she was not asking him to perform or to testify on her behalf, that his only role, if he chose to come, would be to be there for Weston. Archer said he would come. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of late March mornings when the light is still thin, but the air has started carrying the memory of warmth. The board of the Mercer Foundation convened in the main conference room of the foundation's office building, 12 members seated around a long table, and Von Mercer presented his concerns with the composed authority of someone who had been practicing for this performance for the better part of a year. He spoke about Celeste's grief, her isolation, the strain of single parenthood, the way that a mother's love for a disturbed child could compromise even the most capable executive's judgment. He was good at it. Several board members were nodding with the cautious sympathy of people who were not yet persuaded, but were willing to keep listening. Then Celeste presented the documents. Weston came into the room with Dr. Meredith and Delaney and Archer, and he was very small against the conference room's high-backed chairs and the assembled faces of the Foundation's board, and he sat at the table with his hands folded in front of him and looked around the room with the careful measuring expression that was his default now. Archer sat beside him. The room was quiet. A board member, a woman named Gloria Hatch, who had served on the foundation since its founding and who was not someone who showed emotion readily, asked if Weston could share what he had seen. Dr. Meredith explained the process. Weston would sign, Archer would translate in real time, and the translation would be recorded by the attorney present. Weston looked at Archer. Archer signed to him, "Your time, your words, I'm here," and Weston began to sign. He signed for 11 minutes. He signed about the evening in October, about the upper hallway, about the man he called Uncle Vaughn and the green box, and the things he had heard. He signed about being scared, and about the words that had made him scared, and about trying to tell his mother for 8 months and not being understood. He signed some of it with tears on his face, quiet and uninterrupted, and he signed some of it with a focused, precise deliberateness that made several people at the table look down at their hands. Archer translated every word in a clear, even voice, without addition, without editorializing, without anything except the faithful rendering of what the child in front of him was communicating with his hands. Von Mercer interrupted twice, and both times the attorney at Celeste's side spoke a single sentence that returned the room to silence. When Weston finished, he folded his hands again and looked at Archer, and Archer signed, "Done. Good. I'm proud of you." The vote to suspend Vaughn's board standing pending investigation was 9-2, with 1 abstention. The meeting ended at noon, and the building emptied quickly in the way that institutional spaces do after high-stakes events, the silence settling in behind the last person out of the room like water filling a space. Celeste found Archer in the corridor outside, standing by a window with his coat still on, watching the street. She had prepared for this conversation. She had prepared the way she prepared for everything important, with careful consideration of what needed to be said and the correct order in which to say it. When she reached him and he turned to see her, all of that preparation dissolved, and what she said was simply, "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything that mattered in that hallway, and I fired you for understanding something I should have been trying to understand myself, and I'm sorry." Archer listened with the patient, complete attention that Celeste was beginning to understand was simply how he engaged with everything, without the partial distraction that most people brought to even their most sincere moments, without the divided focus of a person simultaneously listening and composing their response. When she finished, he reached for the notepad in his breast pocket, and she noticed her own instinctive gesture to wait, to let him write, to receive what he wanted to say on his own terms, rather than rushing to fill the silence. He wrote, "The hardest part wasn't losing the job. It was watching a child try to be heard and seeing the adults in the room too busy protecting their own position to notice. She read it twice. She did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to add, and she was learning that not everything needed addition. She asked him if he would come back to Mercer Academy, and he told her he would think about it, and she told him that she had one condition she wanted to propose before he decided. Not a condition for his return, but something she wanted to do regardless of his answer. She wanted to build a real sign language program at the school, not a unit in a curriculum, not a brief awareness exercise, but a sustained program that gave teachers, students, and families the tools to communicate across the gaps that Weston's silence had shown her were everywhere, in every institution, invisible until someone needed them and found them absent. Archer looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote, "That's the right reason to do it." Weston did not recover in the way that recovery appears in stories, sudden, complete, a door opening on a morning and the child on the other side of it smiling and speaking in full sentences. What happened to Weston was more gradual and more real. He began, over the weeks that followed, to use his hands with growing confidence to sign to Archer in the corridors of Mercer Academy, where Archer had returned as both a consultant and, because certain pipes still leaked and certain ceiling tiles still required replacement, as the person who understood the building's particular mechanical personality better than anyone else. There was a day in April when Delaney walked past the resource room and saw Weston sitting at the low table, not with a therapist or a specialist, but with Piper Hayes, who was drilling him on vocabulary with a laminated card set she had made herself on the family's printer. The two of them bent over the cards in the concentrated silence of children who have found their preferred activity and are not interested in being observed. Delaney walked on without interrupting. She told Archer about it later, and he read her message and wrote back a single sentence. "That's what it looks like when it's working." He signed to Piper Hayes, who became his first real friend, who drilled vocabulary with him the way she drilled everything, with cheerful competitiveness and complete lack of condescension, and who one afternoon signed something so quickly that Weston had to ask her to repeat it 3 times and then laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in 10 months. Celeste learned to sign. She was not natural at it. She had spent too many decades in the language of precision speech, and her hands had their own learned grammar that resisted the new one, but she practiced with Weston every week, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with a vocabulary guide and Weston across from her, correcting her signs with the patient authority of someone who has become the teacher, and she found in those evenings something she had not known she was missing, a form of presence that did not require her to perform competence. She made mistakes. Weston corrected them. They moved through the vocabulary together, and sometimes they stayed at the table long after the guide was closed, talking, with their hands, their faces, the whole body grammar of a language that has no option for the particular human habit of saying one thing while meaning another. The evening she signed, "I'm sorry," and Weston looked at her hands and then at her face and then signed back home. Just that. Just the single sign, his small hands forming the gesture with the deliberateness of something he had been holding a long time and was ready to give. She understood that she had not been looking for the right words for 8 months. She had been looking for the right language entirely. The Mercer Foundation's internal investigation into Vaughn's conduct concluded over the following 4 months and produced findings that resulted in his permanent removal from the board and a referral to the relevant authorities, and the legal proceedings that followed were handled by professionals who were paid to manage them, and Celeste did not attend more hearings than she was required to attend. The financial losses were recoverable. The damage that was not recoverable, the months of her son's silence, the isolation of those mornings watching him in the rearview mirror, was not something she processed quickly or easily or in ways she described to other people, but she processed it in the particular way that honest people process the mistakes they cannot undo, by letting them change the way they move forward. Mercer Academy's sign language program launched in the fall, and on the first day, Delaney Brooks stood in the gymnasium in front of 42 staff members and parents and signed "Good morning." And most of them fumbled it, and someone laughed, and Delaney laughed too, and the sound of it filled the gymnasium in a way that a room full of people trying to speak a new language together tends to fill a space, with the particular warmth of collective attempt. It was a Tuesday in November, low sun coming through the east wing windows in the long amber angle of late afternoon, when Celeste came around the corner and found Archer replacing the hinges on a classroom door that had been sticking since September. She had walked past Archer in this building dozens of times since his return, had stopped to exchange notes when there was something practical to discuss, had thanked him on several occasions for things related to Weston's progress. But this was different from all of those occasions, in a way she did not fully understand until she was already stopped, standing still in the corridor with her briefcase in her hand and the day's last light on the floor between them. She thought about the hallway in February, about the certainty she had felt as she crossed it toward him, the complete, error-free certainty that she was making the correct decision, that she was protecting something, that she knew what she was looking at. She thought about Weston at 2 a.m. signing into the dark. She thought about 47 pages in a green box behind a pine board, found because a 7-year-old boy had spent 8 months trying to be understood and had finally, in 4 minutes, with a man in a gray maintenance uniform, been given the language to be heard. She thought about all the things she had been certain of that had turned out to be simply the limits of what she had been willing to perceive. Archer looked up from the door hinge and saw her standing there, and he waited with his characteristic patience, not filling the silence, not making it easier, not doing any of the things that people do when a moment is stretching in a direction that is uncomfortable. Celeste set her briefcase down on the hallway floor, and she raised both hands, and she signed, slowly, the way you do when a language is still new and each gesture requires the active cooperation of your full attention, the 2 words she had practiced until they felt something she could give instead of something she was asking for. Thank you. Her hands made the gesture a second time, steadier. Archer watched her hands. He set down the hinge tool. He signed back a single word, simple, 2 syllables, the word that named the one thing she had spent a year learning to do, the one thing that had changed everything for her son, the one thing that Archer Hayes had been able to do even in silence, even in the spaces between words, even in the corridors of a school that had not known how to look at him. Listen. Celeste Mercer had spent 35 years building a life that looked flawless from every angle, and she had fired the one man who understood that the most important conversations are the ones that happen without a sound. But the morning she stopped walking past him, the morning she set down her briefcase and used her hands and let herself be corrected and waited and tried again. That was the morning she finally learned what her son had been trying to teach her from the very beginning.